Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Dark and Precious Storytime. I'm Dark.
And I'm Precious.
In this podcast, we flex our creative muscles and mainly your patience by narrating original stories complete with totally professional sound effects. This will be the best 30 minutes of your life you'll never get back. Today's episode is called The Forest Terror, where young Abbie's unlikely friendship with a mysterious creature actually saves her from a terrible fate.
Abbie Tilson sat on a large, smooth tree stump next to a small creek. She smiled up at the soft breeze that ruffled the leaves overhead and kept the heat of the sun from settling on her face. She loved this spot because although it was only a 10-minute hike from her backyard, it was like another world. Since she lived on the edge of a national forest, she didn't have to worry about hearing any traffic sounds, droning planes, or any other sounds of industry that would mar the peaceful stillness of the woods. Across the creek, an enormous creature emerged from the trees. It somewhat resembled a man in that it had 2 arms and walked on 2 legs, but it was at least 8 feet tall and covered with thick, dark hair, and its features were more ape-like, with a large bony brow and a high-sloping forehead. It had light brown eyes that stared at Abbie and grunted softly. This was another reason she liked the spot. This was where she met with her friend Harry, an honest-to-goodness Bigfoot. They'd met at this spot a couple years ago on Abbie's 8th birthday. She had been wandering near the creek in the woods by their house and had come upon a gigantic footprint stamped into the damp mud of the creek bed. While she squatted staring at it, she became aware of a stillness in the forest and felt eyes watching her. She glanced around and spied the giant creature standing partially behind a tree about 30 feet away. A naturally curious child, Abbie wasn't afraid, but also knew about stranger danger, so she called out to it, "Hello?" The creature started at the sound of her voice, then turned and disappeared into the thick bushes without a sound. After that, Abbie would visit the same spot each day, leaving fruits or vegetables near the stump. The snacks were always gone, but in their place there would be a small offering. Sometimes it was a pile of smooth round pebbles, sometimes it would be a stack of tiny twigs, and so, over the next couple weeks, Abbie would exchange gifts with her enigmatic friend until one day she came face to face with it. She was putting a handful of radishes in the usual spot when she heard the slightest rustle a few feet away. There was also a strong wet dog odor, and she looked for the source of the smell, spying the creature standing just a few feet away. She gasped in surprise and sat back on her butt. The creature shifted back and forth like it was nervous. Now that she was closer, she could see the powerful musculature of its arms and bright, intelligent eyes. Abbie recovered quickly, standing up and brushing the dirt from her pants. "Well, hello. My name is Abbie. What's yours?" she called. It just stared at her, occasionally glancing around. "Do you speak?" Abbie took a step toward the creature, who tensed as if getting ready to run away. She stopped and stood still. Abbie held out her hands, palms up, in kind of a surrender gesture. "I won't hurt you," she reassured it. It relaxed a little and tilted its head as she repeated her question again. Then it turned and disappeared into the bushes again. This time she heard a soft hooting sound before it left. Of course, she'd had to go online to find out what kind of animal it was. After wading through countless websites and conspiracy theories, she found it was, in fact, what people would call a Bigfoot. However, she also knew that she could never tell anyone because they would either not believe her and think she was crazy, or they would believe her and this place would be overrun with hunters, reporters, or worse, the government. So she kept it to herself, enjoying the companionship of her friend, who she'd dubbed Harry after watching a movie called Harry and the Hendersons. In that movie, a Bigfoot ends up living with a suburban family. Abbie thought it was a dumb movie, but the Bigfoot in the movie had been sweet and gentle, which reminded her of her friend, so the name stuck. Days turned to weeks, then months. Abbie and Harry often walked through the forest together. She would walk along a hiking or game trail, talking incessantly about whatever crossed her mind, while her giant companion would slide through the heavy trees and foliage like a ghost, hooting occasionally as if to let her know he was listening. Despite all the time they spent together, she still didn't know much about him. She suspected he was alone and seemed like he was relatively young since he didn't have any gray hair. He was very gentle, even allowing her on a couple occasions to ride on his shoulders. One time, he'd even climbed a tree with her, and she'd been able to see out across the entire valley. Today, however, Harry crossed quickly to Abbie. He seemed agitated and kept glancing out at the forest. Abbie had come to understand his little hoots and gestures and could tell he was worried. "What's wrong, Harry?" she asked, sliding off the stump. He hooted insistently and nudged her in the direction of the trail leading back to her house. "I just got here, Harry. I don't want to go home yet," she said. Harry nudged her again, this time a little harder. Of course, from something as big as Harry, that meant Abbie actually staggered a little. He never acted like this, so she was curious. "What's wrong, Harry? Is it hunters?" He seemed to be focusing his attention northward, so Abbie looked in that direction too. The creek meandered for almost a mile before it hooked to the left, a spot marked by a couple large boulders. As Abbie watched, what looked like a huge elk walked out of the trees, but it moved differently, more jerky and furtive, and seemed to be sniffing the air. Then, as it passed in front of the boulders, it stood up on its rear legs, shoving its pointed nose in the air as if tracking something. Then it lowered its head and darted into the trees across the stream, amazingly fast for something so large. Abbie felt a chill and was suddenly glad they were downwind of the creature. She noticed Harry was growling softly in his chest. Those boulders were about 10 feet high, and the animal's antlers were easily higher than that. Where Harry was broad and muscular, this thing was gaunt, but with a distended belly. Abbie didn't think it had seen them, but felt uneasy nonetheless. She looked up at Harry. "What was that, Harry?" He watched a moment longer, then without warning, scooped Abbie up and sprinted into the trees. Abbie was so surprised she simply held on to his fur, amazed at how fast he was moving without making any noise. A couple minutes later, he stopped and squatted, planting Abbie on the ground. She could see she was behind the hedges that lined her backyard, so nobody in the house would see Harry if they happened to look out. He nudged her again and then hooted, his eyes pleading. "I'm going," she sighed and hugged his arm. She took a couple steps toward the house, then turned back to say something else, but Harry was gone. "Be careful, Harry," she whispered, then ran inside. The next day, Abbie watched the news, horrified. 3 people had been mauled and partially eaten while walking a couple miles away. The gruesome nature of the attack had led officials to pin the blame on an enormous rabid bear, which was the only thing big enough to cause such damage. Over the next couple of days, local hunters were recruited by the Forest Service to search the area for any bears. Several black bears were captured or killed, but Abbie knew it was no bear. She was almost certain that the creature she and Harry had seen had something to do with the dead hikers. She worried that it might hurt Harry, but knew also that Harry was capable of defending himself. After a week, things began to settle down. One night, she heard her dad turn on the news again. Her heart sank when she heard the word Bigfoot and ran out to see the local man on TV superimposed over an artist's rendering of something that looked similar to Harry. The man was describing how he and his party were camping in the woods when a huge monster attacked them for no reason, hurling rocks and roaring. They were finally able to drive the beast away, but not before they captured footage. Then they showed a video taken on the hunter's cell phone. It was grainy and jumpy, but for a split second, Abbie could see Harry's familiar shape moving through the trees as the hunters screamed and ran for their guns. Then there was a picture of 2 men, obviously a selfie. The anchorman explained that they were hunters who'd been killed the previous night. within yards of the rest of their hunting party. Similar to the hikers, the two hunters had been disemboweled and partially eaten, and nobody had heard anything. The news anchor went on to explain the deaths were due to the Bigfoot monster, now called the Forest Terror. He somberly reminded everyone to stay out of the woods until the beast was caught or killed. Despite her protest, Abbie's dad forbade her from even leaving the house, much less going into the woods. She ran into her room, crying tears of anger and frustration. She knew Harry wasn't the one eating people, but there was nothing she could do to protect him, so she waited. A deluge of hunters and thrill-seekers flooded the nearby forest. At night, Abbie could sometimes see the beams of the flashlight and hear people shouting as they careened through the woods. She was also riveted to the news, watching breathlessly to see if anyone else encountered her friend. Fortunately, there were no more sightings of Harry. However, 3 more people were killed, which whipped the already excited community into a frenzy. A curfew was imposed, and everyone was advised to travel in groups. Helicopters made slow sweeps up and down the valley as serious-looking men with dogs and big guns roamed through the woods. At this point, the government locked down the forest itself, closing all the trailheads, boat ramps, and public access roads, and allowing only the most experienced and professional hunters to enter the woods. Then one night, Abbie heard her dad talking about a group of men that showed up in town. Gauging by the expensive gear and weaponry, he figured they were military. Abbie was terrified. They were sending in the government, and she had seen enough action movies to know what this meant. Now there would be highly trained men with GPS, satellites, drones, night vision, and even rocket launchers low-crawling through the woods. Abbie watched a lot of action movies. If they saw Harry, he was as good as dead. Abbie decided that she had to warn Harry, so she waited until her parents went to bed and loaded up her backpack with binoculars, a flashlight, and a few apples in case Harry was hungry. She eased quietly out of the house and started jogging down her trail, thankful for the half moon, which shed just enough light for her to see where she was going. Once she got to the creek bed, she stopped and gaped in astonishment. The formerly pristine wilderness was muddy and strewn with garbage. Bushes and smaller trees that rested near the creek bed had been cut down, and there were remnants of old campfires everywhere. Even the stump where she'd sat waiting for Harry was now marred with carvings and partially blackened, as if someone had tried to set it on fire. She hurried over to it and started whispering for Harry. She stood there for a while, listening to the woods. Far off, she heard a dog barking. She continued calling for Harry in hushed tones while eventually calling his name out loud a couple times. Harry! Harry! After about a half an hour, there was no sign of Harry, so she started walking back toward the trail to her house. Then she heard Harry's familiar soft hoot and whirled to see his huge shadow a few feet away. She ran over to him and hugged his neck as he squatted, putting a giant hand gently on her back. "Oh, Harry, I'm so glad you're okay," Abbie exclaimed in relief. In the muted glow of the moonlight, she could tell he wasn't doing all that great. His typically fine pelt of hair was matted and gnarled with leaves, mud, and sand. Her heart broke when she saw the sadness and defeat in his eyes. "I don't believe what they're saying about you, Harry. I know it was that other thing. Have you seen it? Are you staying away from it?" She glanced nervously down the creek towards the large boulders where they'd seen the antlered creature. Harry stood up and gestured toward her house, obviously directing her to return home as he'd done before. "I know, Harry, but I need to warn you, the government is here. They have night vision and drones and stuff. They could find you and hurt you, so you need to run away. Go far away." She pointed up towards the northern end of the valley, where she knew Harry could lose himself in the untamed wilderness. Harry turned to look where she was pointing when she heard a series of rapid clicks and small whooshing sounds. Suddenly, several bright metal objects appeared, sticking out of Harry's chest and neck. He grunted in surprise and took a step toward Abbie. She screamed and dove out of the way as his eyes rolled back in his head and he collapsed forward, slamming to the ground. She scrambled to her feet, looking around for the source of the sounds, and jumped as the dark shadows of 4 large men materialized out of the darkness next to her. The biggest one was speaking in a low voice as he grabbed her arm. "Echo Base, this is Team Charlie. Tango down. Civilian non-com in custody, approximately." Abbie wrenched her arm free and sprinted a couple steps before a rough hand grabbed her from behind, hoisting her into the air. She kicked and screamed again until she heard a ripping sound, and a piece of tape was slapped over her mouth. Whoever was holding her set her down and snatched her backpack from her shoulders as the big man grabbed her hands, binding them in front of her with plastic zip ties. He continued talking as if nothing happened. "Repeat, Tango neutralized. Child non-com in custody. Please advise." Abbie watched as the other 3 men crouched around Harry, securing his ankles and wrists with chains and manacles. Then they draped a large cargo net over Harry and started connecting the corners to create a kind of cocoon. Abbie's eyes widened in understanding. They weren't killing him, they were capturing him. This was actually worse, since they would probably take him away and perform terrible experiments on him. She started squirming and making as much noise as possible, but, with the tape over her mouth, all she could do was manage a series of squeaky, muffled shrieks. The big man glanced at her. Although all of the men's faces were covered in black grease paint, she could see the irritation on his features. One of the men twirled a finger at the speaker, who was conversing in low tones with whoever was on the radio. He nodded sharply and said in a loud, clear voice, "Echo Base, Tango ready for extraction." "Say again?" he keyed into his mic. He cocked his head at the voice on the other end. "Affirmative," he responded with a sigh. He motioned to one of the other men, then at Abbie. The man took out a large piece of plastic sheeting, spreading it on the ground and weighing the corners down with rocks. The big man strode over to where Abbie was sitting and picked her up. She started squirming again, but her struggle didn't seem to faze him, and he tossed her onto the plastic. There was a flare of pain as she landed on her shoulder, and the impact knocked the wind out of her. Gasping for air, she turned to see him pull his pistol and screw something long onto the end. Abbie recognized it as a silencer from the movies she'd seen and suddenly understood what was happening. They were going to shoot her. She froze in panic, unwilling to believe she was going to die like this. The man aimed the pistol at her, and Abbie had time to marvel at how the barrel looked as big as a train tunnel before she heard an odd, high-pitched howl from nearby. The man paused, looking around for the source of the noise. Then she heard a curious choking noise and a moan. Looking past the big man, she saw one of his partners stumble into the moonlight, midsection glistening, and scream into the tape as an enormous pair of antlers swept into view, skewering the other 2 men while ripping at them with elongated claws. They uttered brief screeches of fear and pain before they were torn apart. Her would-be executioner recovered surprisingly fast, raising the pistol and firing at the apparition. The gun didn't make much sound, but she could see large chunks of hair and flesh flying off the beast. It shook off the 2 bodies and uttered that keening howl again, facing its attacker. Now out of bullets, the man was reaching for something at his waist when the horned creature closed the space between them almost instantly and grabbed the man, burying its pointed snout in his face. He managed a short cry of pain before the creature literally ate his face off. Abbie scrunched her eyes at the horrible crunching sounds as the monster feasted. After a moment, it dropped the body, which landed on Abbie's legs, spilling warm fluid all over her. She gagged at the sensation and the rotten smell of the horned animal. It turned almost leisurely to see one of the men crawling feebly towards the trees, leaving a dark trail smeared on the rocks of the creek bed. The creature leaped at the man, landing on his back and furiously clawing at the remaining flesh until the man was still. It ducked its head, and Abbie could hear the sounds of it feeding again. Her legs were starting to fall asleep from the weight of the big man's body, and she shifted slightly, making the plastic crinkle. The sound stopped and she froze. Out of her peripheral vision, she saw the creature raise its head and sniff the air, then rise to its feet. She could see it had bright, glowing eyes that were scanning the area for the source of the sound. Sniffing again, it started toward her, then got distracted by another body and fell to gnashing at the soft midsection of another man. A slight movement caught her attention, and she saw Harry's form stirring within the confines of the cargo net. He was mostly hidden from the monster behind a couple of small boulders. She was happy he was okay, but if he kept moving, he'd end up disemboweled like the others. She willed him to stop moving, but of course he continued to squirm, thrashing more violently until he drew the monster's attention. It stopped and sniffed the air again, slowly edging around the side of the boulders as Harry ripped and clawed his way out of the netting, grunting and heaving with exertion. He leapt to his feet as the creature let out another one of those weird, high-pitched howls. Harry stood stock still as he took in the first monster, then the carnage. He saw Abbie lying still and took a step in her direction. She shook her head slightly and he relaxed, turning back to the other beast. However, the monster's lamplight eyes caught Abbie's movement and it howled again, crouching and leaping towards her with its claws outstretched. But a huge hairy arm shot out, slamming a fist into its side, sending it skittering and rolling across the creek bed, where it ground to a stop about 40 feet away. Harry glanced down at the steel manacles on his wrists and ankles and casually twisted them off. They made a tiny clinking sound as they hit the stones on the ground. He bent to Abbie, arms outstretched to pick her up, when a flurry of claws and antlers barreled into him. The two creatures thrashed, roared, and howled, rolling in and out of the patches of moonlight. Abbie finally wiggled out from under the dead man and climbed to her feet. She started running, risking a glance back. She saw the creature impale Harry and lift him high in the air while Harry kicked at its face, and then it flung Harry far out into the trees. Abbie heard a disheartening thud and crack as his body collided with the trees somewhere off in the darkness. Then she saw the antlers and malevolent eyes turn upon her, and she started running again. She reached up to pull the tape away from her mouth, gasping as she ran, eyes wide with fear. She heard the creature's howl and pushed her legs to go faster. Normally, she could navigate the trail just using the moonlight. However, she was sprinting with bound hands, and some creature was trying to eat her, so her concentration was a bit frazzled, which is why she wasn't very surprised when a tree root seemed to reach out from nowhere and slapped her foot, sending her sprawling. Pain shot down her left arm again, and she bit back a cry of pain, stumbling to her feet and resuming her run. This time, the keening howl was right next to her, and its rotten stench filled her nostrils. She instinctively threw herself sideways just as the antlers and claws ripped through the air where she'd been. She landed, bouncing her head off a rock, which caused her vision to briefly go dark, then blurry, as she tried to focus on the monster. The creature hadn't expected her sudden evasion and stumbled a bit as it landed on the trail before her.
It was deliberate.
She felt like she was moving through molasses, and her vision kept fading in and out. She couldn't make anything work, and could see the outline of the monster moving towards her. A huge, deep roar echoed through the forest as a massive form erupted from the trees, plowing into the creature. Abbie saw Harry grab the antlers, turn in a half circle, and hoist the entire creature through the air to slam it solidly on the ground. She heard bones break as Harry repeated the move, simply using the antlers to hurl the creature to the ground again and again until it stopped struggling. Then Harry placed a foot on its neck, twisting and pulling the head until he'd ripped it from the body and tossed it into the bushes. As Abbie's eyes closed, she saw Harry lean in and felt him lift her. Then she blacked out. Abbie woke to a bright light streaming through hospital curtains and a cast on her left arm. There was also a stranger sitting in the chair next to her. "Hi, Abbie. I'm Mr. Owens," the man said. "Do you want some water?" He pointed to a plastic cup beaded with moisture on the bedside table. She nodded, and he held the cup while she sucked cool water through a straw. As he returned the glass to the table, he said, "Abbie, your parents told me I could ask you a couple questions before you go home. Are you good with that?" She nodded again. The man was very plain, almost as if designed not to attract any attention, but may as well have had government agent tattooed on his forehead. "Well, first, you're very lucky to end up with only a broken arm and a concussion. Things could have been a whole lot worse if that bear had caught you, right?" He smirked at her look of confusion and explained, "According to the news, a group of professional hunters managed to kill the forest terror, which was nothing more than a rabid bear." Abbie kept her face cautiously neutral. "It's okay, Abbie. You and I both know that's not what really happened, right?" He leaned in conspiratorially. She kept perfectly still, willing herself not to give away anything. "Have you ever heard of a Wendigo, Abbie?" The question surprised her, and she shook her head. "It's a mythical beast that looks a lot like, well, a mutated elk. Said to personify evil spirits, feeds on human flesh, etc. In general, very bad news. For whatever reason, it chose your area of the forest for its hunting ground. Luckily, your friend did us all a favor when he stomped the shit out of it." Abbie was surprised by the profanity, but even more so by his casual acknowledgement of Harry. Then she remembered the dark men and the silenced gun. "They were going to take Harry. They were going to shoot me," she croaked. Owen shifted at that and coughed uneasily. "We thought Harry, was a threat. We didn't even know about the Wendigo until we found pieces of it. At that point, we realized that was what was causing all the trouble. As for the other thing, well, I don't know anything about that, but I can assure you that I will look into it," he said evasively. A million questions were fluttering around in Abbie's mind, but she really cared only about one thing. "Please leave Harry alone, Mr. Owens. Don't try to capture or experiment on him, please." She turned to him, grabbing his sleeves in desperation. Owens looked uncomfortable again. "Look, Abbie, I'm not in charge, but I can tell you that, with the Wendigo gone, Harry's safe as long as he doesn't cause any trouble." She leaned back into her pillow and sighed with relief, closing her eyes. When she opened them again, the sun was lower and her dad was sitting in the chair. She reached out to him and he hugged her gently. She nodded dutifully as he chastised her for venturing into the forest by herself, and smiled ruefully as he repeated the news story about the forest terror. Sitting up straighter, she asked him which government agency Mr. Owens worked for. Her dad only gave her a quizzical look and said, "Who's Mr. Owens?" The end.
The end. We hope you enjoyed listening to our story as much as we enjoyed telling it. We're pretty sure you have more friends than we do, so be sure to tell them all about us and click to follow our podcast. You can also follow us on Instagram at dark.n.precious or follow us on Facebook at Dark&Precious Storytime. Feel free to leave us any feedback or if you have any story suggestions. Who knows? You might just hear your story idea come to life in the next episode of Dark&Precious Storytime. I'm Dark.
And I'm Precious.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.